And then I started gliding, so flying sailplanes. That was more by coincidence because next to the little village where I grew up, there was an airfield and a local club. And I think I found this fascinating, so I did this quite intensively also during my times when I studied. So I typically focused my studies on the winter to have maximum free time during summer. Across the group, I would say the main thing we try to do to be globally local. And I think this is quite interesting. If you go to China and you ask, where's DHL from? Most people won't know. I typically, get up 6:15, start somewhere around 7:30 or 7:40, and then I need to be careful that I don't get in trouble with my wife in terms of really telling the truth, but I have a fairly flexible end, let's call it that way. I try 2 days a week to be home at least before 8. I think if you're not able to compartmentalize and able to switch off and also ignore certain hard problems for some hours, you should not take a job like mine. I would highly discourage you from doing that. I made it a point not to spend time on things that are not important to me. So my clothing, for instance, is entirely standardized. I only have one type of shirts. I always buy the same shirts. And I needed to change shoes now because after 15 years and I think 19 pairs, the producer stopped producing that type of shoe.
Dear students, welcome to the CEO Leadership Series. My name is Cheng-Wang Lee, and it is a tremendous pleasure for me to present to you the CEO of the DHL Group. The DHL Group is the world's leading logistics company. It is also one of the most international companies in the world and operates in more than 220 countries and territories worldwide. In addition, DHL is also one of the largest corporations in the world and is actually the second largest German company measured by the number of employees with about 600,000 employees around the world. Dr. Tobias Meyer has been CEO of DHL since 2023 and is one of the most important and influential top executives in the global logistics sector. Dr. Meyer initially studied industrial engineering in Darmstadt. He then joined McKinsey as a consultant and returned to Darmstadt to obtain his doctoral degree on the topic of global production networks, a model for cost-optimized location choice. He then returned to consulting and worked in the Frankfurt and Singapore offices and then became partner of the firm. After around 3 years as partner, he joined DHL as Executive Vice President for Corporate Development. He then became Chief Operating Officer, that is COO of Global Forwarding, and then COO and Head of IT for Post and Parcel Germany, before becoming the Head of Post and Parcel Germany and also a member of the Executive Management Board, that is the Vorstand of the entire DHL Group. After a while, he took on the role as Head of Global Business Services before becoming, in 2023, as mentioned, Head and CEO of the entire DHL Group. It is a tremendous pleasure for me to welcome Dr. Meyer here to our campus. For one, because he's very experienced and successful, and I'm sure has many stories and pieces of advice to share with you and with us. And also because I just ordered a new credit card, actually an EC card, that is to be delivered by DHL, and I hope that thing arrives safe and sound. So please treat our guests very nicely today, and please help me and very warmly welcome Dr. Tobias Meyer.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Usually I only get the applause afterwards, so I'm glad that we already get some. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, very welcome to our campus. It's a great pleasure to have you here. How about we start from the beginning? Can you maybe tell us a little bit about your childhood and youth?
So I've actually a pretty ordinary German upbringing, I would say. I grew up in the northern part of Hesse, in the middle of the country, but during a time where that was the border of the country as well, because it was pretty close to the German border. Many of you will not have any recollection of that time, but it was quite depressing. When I was about your age, the border was still closed, and I had multiple occasions where I also visited the German border, which was heavily fortified at the time, had a belt of mines, so that particularly people from Eastern Germany couldn't flee to Western Germany. I then had one choice that I never regretted in terms of choosing hobbies. So I tried all sorts of musical instruments, as you know, the parents try to have a positive influence on your upbringing. That didn't go very well. In terms of soccer and similar sports, I was okayish, but also not great. And then I started gliding, so flying sailplanes. That was more by coincidence, because next to the little village where I grew up, there was a airfield and a local club. And I think I found this fascinating, so I did this quite intensively also during my times when I studied. So I typically focused my studies on the winter to have maximum free time during summer to go flying. But it's also, I think, a good thing, because the element of flying instills quickly a sense of responsibility for yourself. Because if you're up there, you should somehow think how you get down again. And you need to have a certain element of self-responsibility. Finished normal high school, and then was first thinking about becoming an architect or a civil engineer. In the early 90s, and civil construction wasn't going so well in Germany, so I then decided to do mechanical engineering and industrial engineering in Darmstadt. So there's a mix of the classical mechanical engineering, particularly for the first 2 years, and then an increasing mix of economics, of management, and also of legal subjects. And I have to say, in hindsight, I think that was a good choice. Particularly a bit of legal things helps if lawyers, give you very persistent advice, that you also have some understanding on how the legal system works, and you are not afraid to also read the law directly. And particularly the engineering bit instills a bit of pragmatism. The engineer doesn't carry so much about whether things are right or wrong, but whether they work or not, right? If you build a bridge, if you build an aircraft, what matters is that it works. And I think that's a good attitude in management as well. And having the ability to add up some numbers is also typically quite beneficial. I always say I made a career out of a rule of thumb and Google Maps. It's not quite true, but both elements I think are quite helpful to be able to do triangulations and also have a bit of a sense of the practical world and where things are.
All right. Looking back at your studies in Darmstadt, would you have done things differently, or do you have any advice for our young students here?
So I think my studies, I did 1 full year in the US at the end of it. I found that very helpful. The US is a very specific experience. I did this in the middle of the cornfields south of Chicago, which is a pretty lonely place in itself, other than the surroundings. Urbana-Champaign is the University of Illinois. Has a very good engineering campus. So if I compare the library to what Darmstadt had to offer at the time, I found it quite impressive. Also the labs, what you could do there. But also the living in the US and the US attitude was very helpful to absorb as a college student.
All right. And then after you've finished your studies, you decided to join McKinsey. Can you maybe tell us why you decided to apply there and what the process was like?
Yeah, that was actually more by accident. So during my studies, I did multiple stints of internships with Airbus Industry in Toulouse. I wanted actually to do the A3XX program, which later became the design program for the A380, right? The first double-decker, it's not quite true, but the first double-decker jet engine, let's call it that way. The more distant history, there were double-decker planes as well. But So I wanted to get on that design program, but Airbus was extremely complicated in its HR processes. So even though I had worked for the very same people, when I was in the US, they asked me to go to Toulouse again to do interviews, and at some point I lost my nerve. And then there was this strange company and the strange subject of consulting, which I honestly had never really occupied myself with as a student. And McKinsey did a interview weekend in Arizona, and if you sit in Illinois in winter, in November around Thanksgiving, Arizona suddenly becomes a very attractive place. So I more went there to spend a weekend in the warmth, but then got a job offer with an interesting number. And then I said, okay, why don't I do this for a year?
Okay, so you started in McKinsey's US location, basically.
Actually, so they were quite flexible. So I could have started in Chicago, but I ended up starting in Frankfurt.
Oh, okay. All right. So how was it working as a consultant? I mean, we hear, it's very hard work, long work hours, a lot of traveling. Can you maybe tell us about your first few months and or years?
So I found it quite interesting, also that clients paid for what I was doing. That was, found this in the beginning a bit interesting, but I got into it quite quickly, and I always made sure I can somehow leverage my strength, and I made gradual steps into new subjects. So the first consulting projects I was on had a lot to do with engineering. Mm-hmm. So my very first project was about the maintenance system that Deutsche Bahn should apply. I wish they would have taken some more of that outcome. Then we wouldn't have one or the other debate that we have today regarding our railway system. But anyway, so it was more about the aging and wearing of steel under high pressure of the railway traffic. So I found this quite helpful to basically make steps more into the management space, also having engineering at mind. And then afterwards, I basically only did consulting in transportation and logistics.
Okay.
I never really did anything outside of it. Even what I did for banks during the financial crisis had a lot to do with ships and not so much with the banking as such.
All right. Now you rose through ranks quite quickly at McKinsey. Do you here again have some advice for us? What were some of the success factors that you found in yourself and perhaps also observed in your colleagues there?
So first of all, with McKinsey, your progression happens more or less automatically, or you leave, right? That was at least the method at the time. I don't know exactly how they handle this today, but that was the case, and it was actually not so quick because I also shifted offices. After some years, I went to the Singapore office, and that typically then takes some time to reestablish yourselves. But overall, I would say, hard work. So I didn't mind working long hours, which became a little bit of a problem when I became a team leader. And at some point, this was during a project in India, I recognized that actually not everybody was so excited to work until 1 a.m. And it took me a while to get this into my head. I had also during student times not minded working long hours. And if the topic is really interesting, I found it quite natural. But I had to learn a little bit that it was not everybody's most favorite thing, and that you also as a team leader have to adjust to the needs and expectations of your direct reports of your team members.
All right. And then you decided to return to Darmstadt to earn your doctoral degree. Can you maybe let us know about that? I mean, was it part of that, LEAF program that the consulting firms nowadays have?
That's right. They had that, so it was already clear when I signed up, I would basically do 2.5 years. Maybe you could stretch this to 3. And then you basically had a paid year off. In hindsight, I regret that I really pushed it very hard. So I finished in about 18 months, but I also worked a lot of long hours. And in hindsight, I should have taken it a little bit easier during that time and maybe traveled a bit more. But I somehow felt a little bit under pressure, even though I wasn't financially not in immediate need, but somehow I found it very uncomfortable to move out of the paid time again. Maybe that was wrong judgment at the time, but I tried to push it through as quick as possible. Would I do it again? I don't know. I think it is a certain level of over-specialization. It's also an interesting topic, but yeah, I would probably these days say I could have also used these 18 months differently.
Okay, and just to manage expectations, if you're thinking of doing your doctoral degree or PhD at my chair, 18 months, that's kind of very special, right? It's very, very quick. So now, Dr. Meyer, you then returned to McKinsey.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit what you did then? Did you return to the Frankfurt office or Singapore office? And
so I went, my fiancée at the time, now my wife, moved to India at the time. So I moved to Delhi, and then a couple of months later, she told me she wants to move back because of family reasons to Singapore. She's from Singapore. We originally met in the US. So, and I said, okay, then we moved to Singapore. I marched into the McKinsey Singapore office and said, here I am. Know a little bit about logistics and transportation. I would like to work here. And then I did projects out of Singapore, which was a radius that basically went from Sydney to Beijing to Dubai, which I found very exciting for the first 2 years and very tiring for the next 2 years because it was just a lot of travel. And that feels glorious in the beginning. And at some point you recognize that maybe it's not so exciting after all. Oh. But it was a time, and this is maybe the good thing about consulting, that obviously you get a lot of different insights and impressions. So I did consulting for a lot of Asian airlines, also for DHL in Asia, for shipping companies in a quite wide footprint.
Okay. And then you joined DHL. So can you maybe tell us how that came about? I mean, is it the typical, client asks one of their consultants whether they want to join, or?
Yeah, so I consulted for Deutsche Post quite early. So one of my first projects was the aftermath of the DHL acquisition, 2001. So I knew the company for quite a long time, and also knew obviously some of the people there. And then Frank Appel asked me in 2013 whether I wouldn't want to come over. By that time I had been partner for 3 years, and I thought a little bit, what's going to change now for the next 10 or 20 years as a partner. And I was pretty clear that I didn't want to do consulting for the rest of my life. So it was a welcome opportunity to change over. Maybe in terms of how did I pick the company, I think this is maybe something relevant, because I always found that I really do a good job when I can focus on the job and don't have to kind of second guess my boss, whether I have support of my boss or the environment. So the element of trust, I think, is very important if you want to be productive and thereby successful. So I selected my employer mainly on 2 criteria. Do I trust the institution, and do I trust the person who hires me? And that has served me very well.
Okay. And your first job was as Executive Vice President for Corporate Development. Can you maybe elaborate what you did there?
So that's basically the staff role to the CEO to handle strategy and special topics, so to say. So the classical strategy work, which markets to focus on, where to look for M&A opportunity, but also the special topics that might come around when something doesn't go so well.
Okay, and was the transition difficult, or were there unexpected elements going from partner to, prestigious consulting firm to a large corporation?
I think with DHL you have a strong operator mindset, and I think that's a good thing. So we're generally careful and have maybe increasingly become careful to have a good mix of operators and new people. And I obviously for that time was somewhat new. What helped is that I knew the company and some of its operation already at the time, but I also made it a point and have throughout my career to spend a lot of time in operations. And I think in a business like ours, this is very important.
Okay. You then moved on to the role as COO of Global Forwarding, DHL Global Forwarding or Freight. So how did that transition come about, and what was your job then?
So that came through a mishap, so to say. We tried to change our IT system in Global Forwarding at the time from a very old green screen system and had made the decision to move into a modified SAP system. And that turned out not to be a very good choice. So this IT migration produced a pretty horrific outcome. So we had changed over some countries. We couldn't invoice. We lost transparency about a large part of the business. The cash flow went south. And that led to a management turnover. Mm-hmm. So the CEO of that division left at the time. Frank Appel, the group CEO, took over himself as a divisional CEO. And I had uttered some strong views about this program earlier. And that ended then with a meeting in his office where he said, you had some strong views on this. So now you have the chance to also do something about it. And then I did actually the strategy role and the IT role for Global Forwarding for, I think, 8 months or so in parallel, which was quite demanding in terms of time management. And then I shifted over and took over the full also operations role, which means for Global Forwarding, we do air freight forwarding, ocean freight, so containerized shipping, a couple of specialities we have there, industrial projects, for instance, where we move rigs and wind turbines and bigger equipment of that sort. So that's that type of business. And the main job for the first 2 years was then to find an alternative to that IT transition, which we ultimately managed to do.
Okay. Can you perhaps tell us if some of our students, they have an IT focus? Actually, most TUM students here. So can you maybe summarize some of the levers you use to turn around that business?
So I think, IT architecture, I think, is very important to think through that very carefully, what elements of your IT system you change. And the business always has a drive for functionality. But if you only have that and you don't have a view on architecture, then it becomes more and more sprawling and more complex. And you obviously also need to invest the money at the right time to find the right cycles of replacement. Some companies are too quick on that, and they, spend a lot of time exchanging systems that are not really end of life yet. But obviously, there comes a point, and this is in 2015 when we still had a system which base origin was in 1979. So that was truly old for an IT system, and we had to change it. That was very clear. But in logistics, the problem is you can never stop. You have a global business, and you always have shipments at some point in time. So the migration is actually how do you gradually phase over from one system to the other is as complex and important than the system selection and the building of interfaces and the like. And we, I think, carefully thought through this, ultimately went for our core transportation management system to a provider that was established in that market, was pretty small at the time, is now a very successful company, WiseTech, it's listed in Australia. And that has been a good journey, both for the provider as well as for us.
Okay. You did a good job. You turned around the company or that part of the division. And then how come you were called to become the CEO of Post and Parcel Germany?
So I didn't call myself. It was a bit, Frank Appel, Group CEO, called me to his office and I said, I have a new idea and you have a new job. It wasn't particularly democratic. But he said, look, we have a change in that area. It was a bit similar. The previous CEO of that division has left. He, as a group CEO, took the CEO-ship of that division for an interim period. And I came over as Chief Operating Officer, and we, had some issues in terms of infrastructure where we hadn't done enough investment. In Germany, we increasingly now integrate the delivery of letters and parcels, for instance, which is very important for us to be efficient. We have a specific challenge in Germany that we have a very different workforce structure than all of our competitors due to our legacy here. We're the only provider that basically self-employs close to all delivery people. We have some few exceptions to that, but 97-98% of parcels in Germany are delivered through our own staff. This means we have definitely significantly higher personnel cost, and we needed to find a way through operational measures, but also the upgrading of IT to get efficiency into the system, and that was the main task.
Okay. And then was it another call that made you kind of the head of Post and Parcel Germany?
Yeah, so that was probably what Frank Appel had in mind at that time already, but he didn't tell me. So that came a couple of months later. Okay. That I then became CEO.
If you look back at what you've accomplished as CEO of Post and Parcel Germany, what were some of the things you are perhaps most proud of? Some of the big steps that you took with the division? Yeah.
So I think we have done a couple of good things. If you look at our app today, for instance, the tracking that you have as a consumer, the notification that you get, you can get a 15-minute alert when your parcel arrives. That to do that in a co-determined company is much more difficult than if you do not have that structure, right? We have a strong works council. Any type of IT change is co-determined, so you need to discuss it with your social partner. You have definitely a much longer process, but you also have a chance to obviously take your people along through that. And I think that is some elements of that I think went very well and helped us to enhance our service, both from a quality as well as from an efficiency perspective on the parcel delivery side, and also a transition with the mail business more into a combined delivery model, which for us is strategically very important because obviously the mail volume through digitalization is going down quite consistently and will continue to go down. So we in Germany will ultimately be a parcel delivery company that also carries a couple of letters. All right. And that is a transition that is quite challenging with a workforce of 200,000 people. And we have many people who have worked their entire professional life for us and have maybe for 20 or 30 years done the job in a certain way. And changing that is quite a challenge for the organization.
Okay. And since you became head of Post and Parcel Germany, have you ever not received a letter or package that was sent to you?
So I think on packages, I'm pretty fine. I think I had twice that a letter was delayed, and I also followed then up on why this was more out of interest. It is a challenging business because we are also heavily regulated. And our current regulation, which is under discussion now and under reform, there's a legislative process in Berlin to reform that because the law is from 1998, so 26 years old now, and hasn't really foreseen digitalization and that letter volume, for instance, would shrink. So that is something that is truly challenging because we've kept investing into a business that has a significant regulatory challenge, and we ultimately need to trust that the regulator and the legislative in Germany understands that and also changes the law. Oh. So this has always been quite a challenge to balance that, to have the confidence also in the country and the political leadership that they see what changes are needed to make our investments worthwhile.
All right. You then took on the role as head of Global Business Services?
Yeah, came more out of the transition process. So Frank Appel had decided that he wanted to retire. Mm-hmm. I would also, by the way, have been fine if we would have wanted to continue for a couple of years longer. I really love doing the board, being the board member for Post and Parcel Germany. It's a different business from our other business, but it's very rewarding because we also have a very loyal and I think very good workforce in Germany. But Frank Appel had decided to retire, and at the same time he became chairman of the supervisory board of Deutsche Telekom, and this is why we structured the transition process in a way that I, for some time, only took over global business services, which is things like procurement, IT, fleet. So we have about 90,000 vehicles that we somehow need to manage, and some other more supporting services. And this time where I only had that part of the portfolio, I spent, for instance, on a cybersecurity-related topic, IT in general. And I think that was good that I had some months to focus on that before I now also have the CEO role and thereby have to split my time a little bit differently.
All right. So it was to some extent expected that you would at some point took over the CEO role. There was no big surprise, I suppose?
No, we already announced this 18 months ahead of time. Okay. So it was a very long transition period, which I think only works if the two people, the one who leaves the job and the one who enters the job, are reasonably well aligned.
Okay. And how was it for you to kind of understand that or understood at that time, all right, I'm becoming a CEO of a company with more than 500,000 employees, and you are one of the youngest, DAX CEOs also. I think you're still, even today in your board, are, except for your head of HR, the youngest member. So how was it as a person?
Yeah, Christian Klein entered the job much younger, so there are also other examples. But look, I mean, I know the company and I knew the company at the time very well. I also knew the job pretty well. I had worked together with Frank Appel basically for 10 years. And I think understood, at least from the visible structures, what his day and schedule kind of looked like in his tasks. So that was reasonably familiar. What you just have to get used to is that you don't really have peers anymore. Yeah? So you're the guy who is the ultimate decision taker. And that also has an impact on how the organization perceives you, what you're told, what you're not told. And that is something that you have to get used to. I think this is very difficult to prepare for.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about DHL. Let's talk about DHL. So we know DHL from letters and then as private consumers, I would say. But you have many different businesses. Can you maybe tell us a little bit what DHL does?
Yeah, so first of all, how did DHL come about? Deutsche Post, as some of you might know, was a part of the state ministry in the 80s, basically since after World War II. And at some point it was decided that that ministry would be resolved and split into three parts, what became Deutsche Telekom, Postbank, and Deutsche Post. Klaus Sumbigel took over when that was privatized end of the 80s, and his first big task that he probably also hadn't bargained for was that the reunification of Germany happened, and suddenly the Deutsche Post system at the time in Germany had about 400,000 people, and we got another 180 or so in Eastern Germany to bring this together. And the mail business and parcel business at the time was tremendously laborious and labor intensive. There wasn't much mechanization. So the board decided at the time that they would basically rebuild the entire system, which I still find quite a feat. So in Germany, we built 83 letter hubs, so an entirely redundant system next to the existing one, with letter sorting machines, sequence sorting, so that our delivery people get the households in the exact sequence of how you walk. By now, we, for instance, even for bigger mailbox systems, sort the letters in sequence of the mailboxes. So this type of industrialization was done in the 90s, and then led at the end of the 90s that the business became reasonably profitable, which it wasn't in the beginning. And out of that profitability, as well as the sale of real estate in Germany, we then made a big bet on globalization. So we bought in the time frame of roughly 3 years, nearly 150, 180 companies, depending on how you count it. So basically a company a week. And that one of these companies, one of the bigger ones, was DHL Express, which was originally founded in the States. The original business idea was to carry trade documents ahead of the arrival of the ships, so that cargo could be cleared, before the cargo would actually arrive. That was the original business idea. So we bought all these businesses and then integrated them into different divisions. First, the structure was a bit different at the time. We put more parcel and express together, which we later separated. But over time, we then developed the businesses that we now have, which is Express, where we also operate a fleet of roughly 300 dedicated aircraft that we largely own. We have our global forwarding business, which is an asset-light business, so we don't own ships and we don't own aircraft in that business, but we use the existing capacity of ocean liners and airlines to ship stuff from A to B, and that is a pure B2B business. We have contract logistics, DHL Supply Chain, which is warehousing and distribution solutions across many sectors, from pharma to high-tech to other things, but we operate a large footprint of warehouses, roughly 30 million square meters worldwide. And then we have Post and Parcel Germany, which is kind of the business we do since 1993. So it has been a while since that business model was derived. And our youngest division and smallest division is what we call DHL e-commerce, which is basically the parcel business outside of Germany. All right. Which is still small, but parcel and e-commerce is obviously a big and important trend for us, so it's also the fastest growing division.
All right, and we discussed this before. I mean, DHL is basically at the forefront of every single either development, a crisis, or a mega trend. So let's talk about some of them. For example, sustainability. I mean, you're moving a lot of freight around, a lot of things. So how do you address the topic of, I suppose, improved sustainability for the company?
Yeah, so for us, particularly the E component of sustainability, nowadays people talk about ecological, social, and governance, but the E component and the CO2 component is obviously a really big thing. We directly and indirectly through our subcontractors have about the emissions of Denmark as a company, and that's obviously a sizable footprint. And it is something where we all know that we need to move the needle relatively quick. Now, we have done, I think, also pioneering things, but we've also burned our fingers with that. So we bought a company about 10, 12 years back to manufacture our own battery electric vehicles. Because the challenge was we had discussions with many manufacturers, and they all said, you're welcome, we build you a vehicle, but first of all, we want to be paid up front for the development cost. And second, the vehicle basically has an over-specification of what we need. Our vehicles in Germany, on average, you always need to be careful with averages, but on average drive around 35 kilometers a day. So, this discussion around vehicles that can drive 500 or 700 kilometers with big batteries is irrelevant for us, and we don't want to pay for big batteries, which have now become more affordable, but 10 years ago this was a real issue. So we did these type of things, and we are now the biggest purchaser also of sustainable aviation fuel, but particularly the issue of flying is something that we spend a lot of time on, because for intercontinental flying especially, there is no technological alternative in sight to the burning of hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons have a relatively high energy density per kilo, and if you want to fly long distances, this is extremely important. And hydrogen has the big disadvantage that even in liquid forms, it needs a huge amount of volume, which I find interesting if I did sometimes discuss with other people, also politicians. Everybody's obsessed with hydrogen, and I also like hydrogen as such. But it's good then also to understand the base properties of this thing, right? And how expensive the handling process is. And, a ton of hydrogen is roughly, 13 cubic meters. It's 77 kilos per cubic meter of liquid hydrogen. Everybody thinks because it's liquid, it has to be somehow the similar density than water, but that's obviously not the case. So these are the things that we intensively discuss. First of all, how do we decarbonize flying, and how do we get to larger quantities of sustainable fuel for that area? This is why I also think we shouldn't use these type of fuels on ground for vehicles, because we need it for higher value applications where we don't have an alternative. The other element for us is trucking, where more is feasible, but the regulation doesn't necessarily make it easier. So we have some areas where everybody wants the ideal end state, like a battery electric truck, which for us is very difficult to operate, also because the charging infrastructure is, we're willing to invest and build that, but we at least need to get grid connectivity. Yeah, and this is a challenge in Germany, this is a challenge in many other European countries. So we're looking also for transitions, for instance, range extenders on battery electric trucks to make that journey. What is very clear for us is the last mile delivery that's going to be electric. We roughly now have 40% of our last mile. In Germany, it's a little bit more, but worldwide, 40% of last mile is electric, and we, by the mid-2030s, are going to be done with that. So that is pretty clear, but this is not by far not the majority of our footprint. 70% of our footprint is flying, and the next biggest piece is heavy trucks.
All right. Fascinating insights and initiatives. Let's switch gears, if you may, and I'm sure our students here have top questions on that and other topics. As I mentioned, digital technology is what many of our students, whether it's TUM or HHN or DHBW here, what they are studying as well. So how does that influence DHL? I mean, it must influence you in many, many ways, right? From your logistics, from replacing letters, from autonomous driving, from generative AI, innovations, etc. Right?
Yeah, and it's not easy to manage that. One of the sayings that I like is distraction is just 2 letters away from destruction. And you need to be careful that what you do in digitalization is focused and really making the business better, and not leading to too much complexity and thereby ultimately destruction. Digitalization is fascinating, and obviously many consumers expect also digitalization, and it has helped us greatly also with our German business, right? If you guys want to write a letter, probably most of you wouldn't go buy a stamp, but we have this service where you pay online and then you get this code that you can write on a letter and then you're done. So I frequently get feedback that, for instance, is a good digitalization step. It's a tiny part of our business, but it's one of those examples where you can fulfill or maybe even exceed customer expectations in using digitalization to make things easier. On the B2B side, this is more complicated because we also need to find interfaces to our customer systems and somehow be in sync with what they do, which, businesses move slower than consumers because we need to move entire ecosystems of systems that are highly interlinked, whereas as a consumer you can be very selective and you typically use a lot of standalone apps. The Apple ecosystem is a little bit more integrated, but generally we are fine with relatively standalone applications. So this is the opportunity and the challenge. Obviously, cybersecurity is also something that keeps you a bit alert. This is not easy to manage and is also something that you need to balance. How much resources do you invest to upgrade and provide new functionality? and how much resources do you invest to keep the existing estate safe.
All right. Let's switch gears again. So let's talk about DHL as an employer. It's a very big company with many employees, has a very high employer engagement index, so seems to have a good culture, but maybe can you tell us why people here should apply at DHL as an employer?
So first of all, our workforce is extremely diverse, and we have obviously a lot of roles, which is simple, hard physical work. And I think that's important to recognize that, because it needs to shape the culture of our organization. And for me, this is always the case when I get the question of home office. I'm very reluctant to talk about that in town halls, because the great majority of our people never has the choice of home office. You know, you can't deliver mail from home. You can't do fulfillment of shipments in a warehouse from home. And this is important also for the support functions to understand that and have the mindset. It doesn't mean that we are not a modern supplier or provider and employer when it comes to back office services, when it comes to our several thousand people that we have in IT, for instance. We have a big own footprint in terms of centers, where we also do own hosting activity, which increasingly goes to cloud, but we also do development work in Cyberjaya, south of Kuala Lumpur, in Chennai, in Prague, for instance, are centers that each have significantly more than 1,000 people. So this is for me always the balance, but we have obviously also for people with academic background, I think very interesting roles, and we also think how we make this attractive for new entrants. So for instance, in the area of data analytics, we decided consciously to have a central team. It's easier for nerds to attract nerds than for somebody like me, who is more a general business guy, to try to hire somebody who wants, to do Python and data analytics for his whole life, or who is obsessed with artificial intelligence. What for us is important in this space, particularly when it comes to digitalization and IT, we don't want to spend our time in what others can do better anyway. So general functionality that a Microsoft or similarly large IT-focused companies would provide, we will be a user of. And trying to outrun them is probably senseless. But we have many areas that are unique to us as a logistics player. Give you the example of customs clearance, right? We do customs clearance obviously on a massive scale. And applying artificial intelligence to do customs clearance and support customs clearance processes is something that is very relevant to us. And in these areas, we then also invest own resources and talent.
Okay. In the field of strategy, competitor analysis is always quite interesting. So if we're taking a look at, your major competitors, UPS, FedEx, and so on and so forth, what characterizes DHL, and how are you trying to, quote unquote, defend yourself in the market and become even better?
There across our businesses, we obviously have different strategic approaches how we do that. So, but across the group, I would say the main thing we try to do to be globally local. And I think this is quite interesting. If you go to China and you ask, where's DHL from? Most people won't know. We're kind of everywhere, but we are not seen generally as a German company. And that, I think, is truly a competitive advantage, that somehow DHL is always seen a little bit local as well. And that cuts across all of our business, particularly true for DHL Express, which truly is everywhere. With some of the other businesses, we are not in all countries. But that is, I think, something that cuts across, and that we also try to further and to instill, which, for instance, means that we hardly have expats left. Okay. So we typically have in the countries, and we try actively to breed local talent to run a country.
Oh, okay, all right. What does the future hold for DHL? You have a strategy 2025. which should end next year, I suppose. So what comes next?
2030, so we always do this in 5-year cycles, so that's at least the procedural answer. Which is something, people also ask me, why do you keep this 5-year interval, right? Isn't that a bit strange? I don't think it is, because what we say also in these 5-year cycles is basically a framework, more about how we run the company, what matters to us as management, what culture we want, rather than concrete business decisions. Do we acquire company A or B? How does the footprint exactly shift? Even though we have certain priorities, and e-commerce is obviously going to stay a priority. E-commerce is going to outgrow GDP for at least another 10 years, if not 20. E-commerce is today what global trade was in 2000, 2005. So that is clearly an important theme. But there are also other sectors. Pharma and healthcare is much talked about. In logistics, some of our competitors heavily focus on that. So there are some other sectors where we have intensive discussion on how we enhance our global service in that space.
All right. Let's take it to a quote-unquote personal level. So what does a day for a CEO look like? I mean, and those questions sometimes can be quite private. So when you get up, when you get to work, how long are your work hours per day? Do you work on the weekends and so on?
So I guess everybody has to find his own pace there. First of all, in terms of travel. So I travel, depends on what you exactly count travel, right? Is today travel or not? I don't know. But I have some intercontinental travel that I also want to do, to visit our sites overseas. And I try to do some longer trips during the year, once a quarter, and then several shorter trips, 2 or 3 days. I have to spend more time in Bonn than I sometimes like, because running a big company indeed comes with a lot of stuff that you just get on your table. Some of that maybe you can manage and delegate over time, but it is just a lot of things that pile up. So there is just also a certain need to spend some time in the headquarters. When I'm in Bonn, I typically, get up 6:15, start somewhere around 7:30 or 7:40, and then I need to be careful that I don't get in trouble with my wife in terms of really telling the truth, but I have a fairly flexible end, let's call it that way. I try 2 days a week to be home at least before 8.
Before 8, all right. And what does your work consist of? Is it mainly meetings? Is it a lot of analytical thinking by yourself? Is it bilateral discussions with your team?
So it's by and large during the day. It's meetings and bilaterals. Okay. So I don't have during the day time for myself. I have a bit of time for lunch maybe, but okay. The day is largely meetings that can be bigger rounds or bilaterals, and then you have the evening to catch up on email.
Okay, so your analytical thinking by yourself, and we hear that quite often from different CEOs because their schedule is so full, is basically kind of quite limited, right?
Well, you do that also with your direct reports. So the job that I started with, my head of corporate development, so head of strategy, I do obviously thinking with him. And you have time to yourself during travel typically, where I never watch films, or never say never, but generally don't watch any movies on planes, and I use that time then to think a little bit through. But you do more work with people because it's just more time efficient.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And was there any part of the job that surprised you, given that you were prepared quite well and observed your predecessor and worked with him quite closely? Was there anything that still surprised you after you took on the role?
Not so much. Okay. Maybe the only thing you have to get used to that things that are stuck with you don't go away if you don't solve them.
All right.
So they either go away sometimes by circumstances changing, but you don't have anybody who says, I help you with this, or, so that's something that you need to get used to, that some some things just are, you need to take care, and it's not delegatable, and it also doesn't really go away. You just need to find a way to deal with it.
All right. Let's move on to some quick-fire questions. You mentioned movies. You don't watch movies that often. What about music? What type of music do you listen to?
AC/DC, for instance, Guns N' Roses.
Okay, all right. What about food? What type of cuisine do you like?
Oh, very broad range. Okay. Shouldn't be too spicy. So my wife is always disappointed that with a spicy Indian curry, I have my challenges. Or sambar belacan, for those who know the Southeast Asian cuisine, is something that I struggle with. But elsewise, very broad range, highly appreciative of the culinary skills that the world developed.
Okay. What about hobbies? I mean, when you do have some time, do you still glide?
So I initiated gliding about 5-6 years ago.
Okay.
So I did it for 15, I stopped for 15, and then I took the conscious choice to restart that. Also because I had the feeling that I sometimes need a bit of time to switch off. Okay. And gliding is unique in the ability to switch off, because you somehow need a certain level of attention to stay afloat, right? You don't have an engine, so you need to find thermals or ridge lift. So you need to, it's different than sitting on the terrace, where I would typically think about work anyway. So I made the conscious choice to do that. It's not happening that often, so maybe 10 times a year, half of that during the week of vacation. But I still find it very enriching and something to look forward to.
And your board is okay with that? Because we had the CEO of Bosch here, and he liked to ride motorbikes, and his board told him, ideally you should stop that hobby. So,
well, there's a rule in life. There's certain questions that you don't ask.
All right, all right. So last question perhaps on books. I mean, what kind of books do you read, and do you maybe have some recommendations for us here as well?
To be honest, currently I read very few books. And this is just because I get so much other stuff to read. Okay. I have several hundred pages on average a day. Okay. And I really struggle, to then push myself to read an entire book. I think this will change. I've read a lot during my life. So as a student, for instance, I read massive amounts of books, including the whole of Goethe and so forth. Not that I would remember much of it, but somehow found it interesting at the time. But currently, I get so much to read that I also need to read, that I'm very selective in what I put on top.
Okay, all right. Please allow me one last question before we hand it over to our students. Now, as I mentioned, you are a very, very young blue chip company CEO, DAX CEO, so you probably have a very long runway. But if you envision looking back someday after retirement at all the things you've accomplished, what kind of legacy, what kind of accomplishments do you want to leave behind?
I think in abstract terms, this is very simple. You want to leave the company in a better state than you took it over. Now, what that practically means obviously needs to be defined. Higher market share, embarking on the right trends, making the right choices on these trends, making the right choices on people, which is amongst the most difficult things, to make the right choices on people. But in abstract terms, I would say leave the company in a better state than you took it over.
All right. Well, we wish you the best of luck, and thank you very much for this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So let's start with the Q&A.
Hello, my name is Angi. I'm a student from Master in Management in TUM. I have a question about the overall strategy of DHL. Today's business environment has a very fast pace of changing. How often do you revisit and adapt DHL overall strategy to face this challenge? Thank you.
So our strategic framework, we basically look at every 5 years. But again, this is about what's part of that framework. We have a purpose, connecting people and improving lives. We have a mission, yeah? Excellence simply delivered in logistics. That's what we try to achieve. We have our values, respect and results. We have something that we call the 3 bottom lines. We want to be the employer of choice, the provider of choice, and the investment of choice. And these are things that we also discuss in management trainings and instill in our country leaders, and that has served us very well. And we continue to evolve that framework, also, leadership attributes, what we want people to have, demonstrate as behaviors. So that is part of our strategic framework, including a prioritization of certain sectors and global trends. Like digitalization is an important theme in our current strategy. But that does not answer exactly the moves that we do on a divisional level, in which markets we are present, what specific skills we need to develop in logistics. For instance, in automotive, right, the shift from internal combustion engines to battery electric vehicles. This implies a big change in supply chains. It also implies a certain change in who's growing in the industry and who's not growing. So these are more ongoing things that we discuss very frequently on an ongoing basis in the board, every quarter, in our divisional boards every month. Currently, to give you a more concrete example, we saw, about 24 months ago that with the geopolitical tensions and first sanctions that the US put on China and Chinese companies, there is a diversification away from a single manufacturing location in China to diversify the supply chain footprint more, to include countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, Turkey, and so forth. So then we put a specific effort to help our customers facilitate those moves and take decisions, for instance, to do land banking in certain parts of Mexico, to be quicker to build warehouses there if that demand really materializes. So that would be a concrete example, but that's not part of our 5-year strategic cycle, but it's more what we then do tactically and discuss and execute within months.
All right. Quite interesting, because strategy is supposed to offer kind of a North Star for a company, some stability, but what about big changes? I mean, have you adapted it drastically? For example, the outbreak of the pandemic, which was, I must say, probably good for your business financially, so to speak, to some extent. So did you then adapt the strategy, or was it still quite stable? All right.
No, this for us was as drastic as it sounds, was a tactical element, and the value of the strategic framework really became very apparent. And it is very good to sit in the headquarters and say, I'm actually pretty sure that our guys out there know what to do, which was, first, employer of choice, first take care of your people. Make sure that everybody gets the best possible safety standards, whatever we can do in terms of masks and so forth. And we were obviously a bit privileged because we could fly stuff where we needed it. So transportation was obviously for others in short demand, but for us pretty easy to do. So we had people on the ground in China to buy protective equipment for our people, and we were much quicker than one or the other state was. And the second thing, keep operations up for our customers. And then the third thing, make sure somehow we collect the cash that we are due to balance the books. So, and this also shows, there's a common phrase now that culture has strategy for breakfast, but for us in the pandemic, that was really the case. Our people knew what to do. And particularly this focus, first take care of your frontline employees or of your employee base at large, really paid off.
All right.
Hi, My name is Eline Holter Henriksen, and I wonder how does work-related challenges affect your personal life? So when you're with your family, do you find it easy to put the work stress behind and relax? And have you ever had challenges that had kept you up at night?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you for that. I think if you're not able to compartmentalize and able to switch off and also ignore certain hard problems for some hours, you should not take a job like mine. I would highly discourage you from doing that. This is one of the intrinsics that you need to have. Elsewise, this is not going to go well for you or for the company. My rule is if I don't sleep well for more than 3 nights a year, I will resign. And there have been last year 2 nights, so it was getting close. One had to do with the regulatory framework in Germany and was so upset about certain political developments that I didn't sleep for 1 night. One had more to do with an operational threat due to some war activities, which is also something to get used to, because we operate in a lot of places that are intrinsically difficult and dangerous, but you need to be able to put this aside. And this has a lot to do in how you structure your work day, and I don't do certain activities at home. This is also why I'm not a great fan of the home office. I worked 1 day in the home office, and that was a day I had COVID. So this just helps the mind, at least for me, to compartmentalize. And I generally do calls and videos and meetings only in the office. There are very, very few exceptions.
What about weekends, if I may ask? So do you work on the weekends as well?
So usually I tried not to. In my current state, this is unrealistic. So I typically work, let's say, half a day or 3/4 of a day across Saturday and Sunday.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Daniel. Thank you so much for the insights. So imagine you have access to a digital advisor that can help you make better decisions when it comes to digital transformation at DHL. What kind of questions would you ask, and what would be the essential elements to trust it over the normal consultancy strategy that they are up there?
So the digital advisor is a human or a digital?
Think about it as a chatbot, so a digital advisor, yes.
So the first thing I would ask the digital advisor is, what's the fact base that you have been trained on? I think that is very important, because the issue of AI, the fascinating as the technology is the differentiation of truth. Right? What is true and what is a hallucination? And the training base for such models is extremely important in that regard. And if I'm reasonably confident that the model has been trained in a way, I would probably ask what this digital advisor thinks about our IT architecture and how it compares to what the model thinks are leading companies. I think in IT, this architecture question is an undervalued question. It's the basis for efficiency in the long run, and also effectiveness. So that's an area where I spend, next to cybersecurity, most of my time. I hope that addresses your question.
Hi, I'm Peter Woodland, and I just wanted to ask, as a leader, what would you say, if any, were your biggest sort of leadership decision mistakes that you have made that have stuck out to you?
So one I already mentioned in my early career, that it took me quite some time to understand that what motivates people is very diverse, and that you also need to develop a value proposition as a leader. And I think that is indeed very important, that you're also clear about what your value proposition is. So my value proposition, I'm not so easy to deal with. Need to be realistic. I think I have some level of humor, but I'm not so much fun to work with. So I always tried fairness, for instance, is extremely important. So I try to make that part of my value proposition. So I spend a lot of time making sure that I treat people fairly, and that obviously they also have the feeling that I treat them fairly. So that was a transition where in the beginning, definitely made some mistakes. The other area that I learned is where you have weaknesses, try to leverage your strength, which goes a little bit in the same direction. And that helps you to mitigate mistakes. Because if I would try to do a lot in marketing, for instance, I would probably not be very successful with that, and my failure rate would be relatively high. So I try to use areas of strength, rational thinking, process structuring, getting the right people onto the right topics. And I focus my own judgment and decisions, my direct judgment and decisions, more in areas where I have true expertise. And I think that helps you to do less mistakes. Because that is also a problem that you have. The more you rise, the less is the error rate that you're allowed to do. If you lead a smaller business, if you get 7 out of 10 things right, you're probably pretty successful. If you lead a larger business, it's better if you get 9 out of 10 things right. And in my job, if you get 1 out of 10 things wrong, that might be the end of it. So that is also something that you have to balance. You need to constrain yourself in taking less decisions to have enough time to get it right on the few decisions that you have to really take.
My name is Anahata Kuman. Hello. I was wondering, what does DHL do to prioritize customer experience and satisfaction, and what does DHL do to continually improve in this area?
So I think this depends, really is very different across our businesses. Consumer-facing businesses are very different because expectations are different, simplicity of use, accessibility, also the error rate and how you communicate errors. And this for us is a challenge also in Germany, because what we are in is a high volume, ultimately low revenue per transaction business, right? I get sometimes, questions, why don't you offer a better customer service, more personalized in our German business? But if you have, 3-4 euros revenue per parcel, what you can offer there needs to be a machine that, in principle, in a very high number of cases, a very high percentage, gets it right. And the rest you somehow need to work through. This is a very different situation than if you have 30 or 40 euros per shipment, which we, for instance, have in our express business. So you need to be honest and calibrate that, and also make sure that the money that the market is willing to pay, you invest for what the average consumer is truly willing to pay. And that then also means, if you have a very broad coverage, as we have in Germany, that you have certain segments that you cannot satisfy. And that is something that is inherent in that business model. And generally in our network businesses, and that is also true for DHL Express, you need to persist on a high level of standardization. So we cannot take every shipment that the customer wants us to take, because that would ruin our quality standards. We have aircraft that are built in a certain way with certain ULDs that allow for a certain size. They need to be loaded in a certain way. So as much as people say we would like to be customer friendly and accommodate every need, in a standardized network, that is impossible. You can specify what you can carry, and then people can give you what fits in the box, and they shouldn't give you what doesn't fit. This is very different when it comes to our contract logistics business, where we do bespoke solutions. We do inbound to manufacturing, for instance, for car manufacturers, where we supply parts up until the assembly line. And this is obviously a highly customized process, is a year-long design journey where we exactly look what the customer needs, how they need the parts. So this is highly customized. But even in that business nowadays, you need to balance that, because certain technology always has significant economies of scale. So our fulfillment operations, for instance, where we pick orders for customers, including e-commerce customers, when you order online, we pick the good and put it in a package box. We increasingly use robotics and automation systems, and that obviously works much better and is much more economic if this is more standardized. So then you need to have the discussion with the customer, okay, we can have a bespoke solution for you, but if you adapt and willing to adapt some of our standards, we are able to provide the service at a different price point, at a different cost point. So this is how I think customer centricity works in our business. It is most important to be clear what you can do and what you can't do. And again, in the consumer business, this is a particular challenge. Yeah?
Hello, my name is Christos Zaid. I study at TUM. And my question is, how big of an effect does geopolitical issues have on DHL being a logistics company, and how do you react to that?
So generally our philosophy is that we're everywhere where this is at all possible. But you also need to recognize, obviously, that in certain situations you need to pull the plug and it doesn't work anymore. So we had quite a number of people in Afghanistan, for instance. And we also handled shipments for the Allied troops in Afghanistan, which in the turnover situation doesn't necessarily make you the most favorable guy in light of the eyes of the incoming party, meaning the Taliban. So in that situation, you need to work hard to protect your people and get everybody out as quick as possible. So, and we were overall, I think, very successful with that. Similar with Russia, we closed down our Russia business. We still have kind of a service for diplomatic mail and certain types of non-sanctioned pharmaceuticals, but we had, our business in Russia was sizable, right? So several thousand people, and taking that decision to close this down and going through the process of closing it down, it wasn't easy, because also what many people in the West didn't recognize, Russia passed laws pretty quickly that didn't allow the local management to close things down, right? And what do you do then, right? You can't, by law, your guys in Russia are not allowed to follow your orders anymore. So what compliance, local compliance versus compliance in the West, how do you sort that, and how do you get your people out of that situation? So these are problems where the world hasn't gotten easier, and I think it's unrealistic to believe that it will get better anytime soon. I think we just have to face the fact that, particularly my generation had an upbringing in an unusually quiet period. Since about 1990, the Western world has been unusually prosperous and quiet. And we're probably back to an unfortunate, more normal mode, if you look into longer periods of history, where we just have to deal with more geopolitical conflicts, which does not necessarily make jobs easier. And is obviously, I think it's very clear, is very unfortunate because it leads to much suffering and less prosperity. But I think it's the reality that will not so easily change again.
Hello, my name is Ali Reza Saygafzadeh. I'm studying Master in Management at TUM. I had a question about which emerging sectors in startup ecosystem is attractive for DHL to invest over next decade.
Startups was the question, yeah?
Which emerging sectors?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we generally don't invest in startup. I think there's also an interesting discussion because this was a bit of a trend that corporates invested in startups, and I think corporates are generally not very good at that. So we only invest in startups very selectively where we have a specific insight in that company. So we invested, for instance, in Global E, which is an international e-commerce facility that is now listed on the NASDAQ, just because we saw as a shipping provider that they were very successful in building up their model, and shipments were growing very quickly. In terms of the sectors that we're interested in as a business opportunity, I already alluded. E-commerce is very interesting. Definitely, the whole renewable space and electric vehicles is going to change massively. We are also interested to do more in returns shipments for e-commerce, also because we believe that returns system in e-commerce will, over time, play a bigger role in the circularity discussion. It is very perceivable that people will use the same logistical processes that are now used for the returns of e-commerce, kind of new merchandise, to also increasingly use that for used goods and bring the material back into circulation. And this is a big opportunity for us to move goods and also do the de-assembly and similar things through our supply chain unit. I always say the best shipment is a shipment from DHL with DHL to DHL. So this is, in this case, would come from the consumer, but we would ship it basically to our own facility to handle the goods then. So these are some examples of trends that we are interested in.
Hello, my name is Henrik Demmer. As a CEO of a company with a long history and culture, how difficult is it to change things within the company while maintaining that culture, or how much thought is put into that?
Yeah, I think the important element about that discussion is to recognize A, what sticks with people, and B, how long it takes to transition through the ranks to really take hold. And people say, I'm not sure whether that's accurate, but I think it's a good rule of thumb that it takes 1 year if you want to ingrain that by layer of organization. So large organizations have 7 to 9 layers. So it would take 7 to 9 years until things have really come to a level of ingrainment and have reached the ground of the organization. And again, probably depends exactly on the topic, but I think overall, I think that is a good rule of thumb. What I've learned is you need to talk in things that people can memorize. So maybe as one example that I used recently, I felt in the current economic environment, things are not necessarily easy, but we have a lot of opportunities as DHL because we have our house relatively well in order. We don't have internal problems like a non-working IT system here or a major restructuring, big M&A acquisition that you're busy with integration. We don't have all that currently. We can be entirely focused on the market, whilst a lot of our competitors have this. FedEx is doing a major restructuring of their ground operations in the US. They still have a bit of the aftermath of the integration of FedEx and TNT in Europe. Kühne-Nagel just announced a new organizational structure, which I wish them all the best with, but it's definitely not going to be a quiet year for them. Schenker is discussed to be acquired by somebody, not us, but somebody, and the government is, sitting on that nest since the last, 24 months, and it typically doesn't make a company better if you're told, we're going to sell you, we're going to sell you, we're going to sell you. So the list of distractions is long. And I said, how do I bring this now across to my top management team that they need to show some more action? And I just then said there, guys, you need to show more bite. Bite. Yeah? You want to see more bite, more commercial. And then now if I visit a sales meeting, I always say, can I see your teeth? Yeah? And obviously people find this a little bit awkward, but I now see that everybody talks about the bite. That we really, this year, we want to be on the customer and so forth. So this is something that you also need to see, that you develop things that people can somehow memorize and hand over with a bit of stories, and there are many examples that I could bring, and have something that is consistent with your overall strategy, that is more an intellectual thing, that you make this also memorable and emotionally appealing to people. I think that is the way to gradually transform and also bring new themes to people. But consistency is very important. We as humans like consistency. Consistency makes it easier to memorize things, it builds trust and so forth. If you're inconsistent with your messaging and also with your logos, this is why, when I started, I always thought this logo stuff is all nonsense, right? But it doesn't make a difference if you suddenly use different colors and so forth. It creates an emotional blockage to people, a psychological blockage. You need to really spend time also thinking, how do you get people into the unconscious psychological safety zone to really focus on the content and what you want to say. And this, for an engineer, is not so easy to understand, that psychological stuff. But if you want to really move strategy forward and culture forward, more importantly, you need to spend some time on how people think, what makes messages receptive, and you can't just hold you will have exciting lectures here, but you can't only hold a dry mathematical lecture that is very rational and logical and expect that to stick with people.
My name is Sonja Ertelt, and hi.
There you. Okay.
Yeah, and so basically back when I was in high school, I also considered studying business engineering in Darmstadt, but then decided to pursue these studies in Stuttgart, and now here I do the master in management at HAX. So I continue kind of to be more of a generalist, and I have a two-part question about the time that you were our age. And so first, if you were to put yourself back in time, did you ever aspire to becoming a leader? So to take as much of the responsibility that you have right now. So was this a goal that you set for yourself and that you worked towards? Or did it somehow happen along the way? And then for the second part is that if you see your greatest accomplishments and struggles in your mid-20s, what do you think of them now, a few years later?
So I think the first question is pretty easy to answer. I never aspired this, but, there's a but to it, I hate to lose. This is something that I don't know. I have a natural competitive streak. I really hate to lose. So I was always satisfied in the job that I was doing. And if you would ask me as a student, I would find it extremely unlikely that I ever make it to lead an organization of 600,000 people. Also because I would have been rational about it and say statistically it's pretty remote. But still, I really hate to lose, and I think I have thereby a natural tendency to do a good job and also focus on those areas where I'm good at. And I think that is a certain recipe for success. That doesn't guarantee that you obviously make it all the way to the top. But I often see people that go a bridge too far in terms of stretching them. And I did this very systematically and made sure, a little bit like the FC Bayern fan. I know it's not true this season, but statistically, this is just a very good bet. So if you pick your teams wisely, you try to pick winning teams because you hate to lose. And I think that is what I did without much thinking about it. In terms of regrets in my 20s, honestly, I don't have many regrets in life at all. So maybe the best achievement is that I found my wife, and she, was also willing to take a certain burden in our personal lives, and I could focus on the job, because it's unrealistic that if you have children, that two partners both do such a job. I think that's also something you have to be clear about. At least if you want to have a family, it is unrealistic that two people have such a job. Not sure whether that addresses your question in terms of regrets, but I'm short on regrets.
More of struggles, like when you think back in time, what did you struggle with in our age, and how did you tackle it maybe?
To be honest, I don't remember much of that, that I really struggled. I also didn't have too many expectations. I started working. If you start working, you don't have many obligations, right? I had my first apartment in Frankfurt was very small. Even in my first job, I earned about double of what I needed. And that, if you're always, maybe that's very lucky, but it is on both sides of the scale. If your expectations and your lifestyle doesn't require a lot, you're generally very satisfied in life.
What was your main or the biggest challenge you ever faced? I mean, I can't believe it was all smooth, of course, right? I mean, whether it was in your 20s or in your professional life afterwards, what was can you pinpoint one major challenge you faced?
I mean, one reason why we left Asia was because of travel. I just felt this is not sustainable anymore. I mean, I had a year in my life where I had as many flights as working days. And there I was at a point where I said, I don't want to do this for much longer. When I came back to Europe, I had made the commitment that I go back to Indonesia for half a year every second week. And I really regretted making that promise, because that is really tough. Time zone wise, there's no direct flight and so forth. So these phases you do have. Also, when I went to global forwarding, honestly, I mean, part of that was tough. We knew that one system wasn't working, but we didn't have a clue for what the alternative is going to be. So we rolled back to the old system, with a green screen, and you have to explain that to an organization that just has many people have put a year or 2 years of their life into that new system. You have to tell them, so I'm very sorry, but it doesn't work. So we go back to square one, and I know that it's not a sustainable solution either. We just need a bit longer to find out what we're really going to do. So this is not necessarily easy, but this is something that obviously enriches your experience as well. Yeah? But it also has a risk to, if I would have, you also have to have luck sometimes. It's also true. So when I selected, for instance, I think it's an episode that I can share publicly, during this time when we had for our global forwarding business, we had to find this new system with a vendor that we ultimately picked. I had actually fallen out. So we negotiated, and we didn't come to a conclusion because we wanted certain terms that they weren't willing to give. And then the phone rang a couple of weeks later, and the owner and CEO said, we didn't really get anywhere, but I want to talk to you again. Can you come to Sydney? I said, okay. I flew to Sydney, and he said, look, I don't really like you, but we want to IPO the company, And my advisors tell me it would be good to have DHL as a customer for the IPO. So this is why I'm willing to give you some concessions. So now, honestly, if this company wouldn't have IPO'd at the time, he wouldn't have been willing to give the concessions, and maybe that would have been the end of my career. So you also have these situations. It's not all skill. Sometimes you also need a little bit of luck. Fortune, as Napoleon said.
Hello, my name is Ece Özdemir. I want to ask something about logistics. The logistics industry is undergoing rapid transformation due to changing consumer expectations. So, how is DHL adapting its strategies to stay ahead of these trends?
So first of all, it's important again to recognize that our business is overwhelmingly B2B. So consumer business in the great majority affect us indirectly. And definitely the shift to e-commerce is the biggest trend that changes our operations, but also the requirements of our customers. And e-commerce has also a lot still to go in transforming B2B supply chains. We see this now, the Temu type of model will also increasingly work for industrial or commercial users. The plumber will in future not go to the wholesale store near his facility, but he will probably also order his tiles or other equipment that he needs increasingly online. So the digitalization and e-commerce trend has much more to go to transform supply chains, including the returns element that many people talk about as circularity. So this is for us the longer term trends that we focus on. The specific consumer requirements in terms of what do you want to see in an app. Do consumers like parcel lockers, for instance, is an interesting question in our industry. But it's also highly diverse by country. So in those questions, I honestly don't get much involved. I like this discussion around parcel lockers because I find it fascinating that in Poland, for instance, half of e-commerce is delivered through parcel lockers, whereas in other countries is a minute 1 or 2%. And it's interesting to see which socio-demographic elements lead to the use of parcel lockers. So there are certain elements where I also occupy myself with. But elsewise, we leave this to our organizations country by country to fine-tune their business model to the specific needs of the consumer.
So, hello, my name is Mavi Mohammed. I have a short question. So it's, how big is your fear of competition? So how far do you plan to include a specific degree of innovation for DHL?
Well, logistics in some parts is a commodity where you risk to be a commodity where you need to, focus on obviously cost competitiveness as well as having the right features that the customer is willing to pay for. We also have certain areas which are very different competitive dynamics. So if you look at our express business, for instance, a global express network has significant economies of scale. Building a global express network is not easy because people pay us to be able to deliver basically every spot of the planet as quick as possible through air transport. That's ultimately our value proposition in Express. And we have two global competitors, which is UPS and FedEx, and some regional competitors. But it's a very different competitive dynamic, both from a value proposition that is pretty stable and also a customer need that is pretty stable. Maybe people want to ship more temperature controlled, and then we enable that. That can be with dry ice or can be with other cooling elements, active or passive. So you have those things at the edges, but ultimately it's a pretty stable model where, through digitalization you offer certain features, but it's not that you need to change your strategy every 2 years. This is not the case. You have a big deployed infrastructure, and you need to be reasonably sure that the long-term trend justifies those investments. In the area of contract logistics, we have a broader area which is more diverse in how you structure your business and also how you enrich the business model. So for instance, we went there a couple of years ago, we started to buy land ahead of need, which we hadn't done previously. Previously, we bought warehouses. If we needed a new warehouse for a customer, we went to a developer, and he had land, and he developed the building and sold the building directly to us or sold it to an investor, and we leased the building from there. And there we evolved the business model, which is, could argue, is a strategic change, to basically do this ourselves. So buy land, develop the building, and then sell it to an investor if we don't want to have it on the balance sheet. So it's those enhancements of the business model that in our industry make quite a difference. Same is true for robotics. Yeah? Also, standardization is very relevant for that. In the past, we needed longer-term customer contracts to be able to basically have security for the depreciation period of a customized automation. An automated warehouse for a certain customer is typically very difficult to use for another customer. Now with robotics, we get the opportunity to own large fleets of robots. So for picking operation, we now have exceeded the 10,000 threshold. So we have big fleets of robots that we can deploy much more flexibly from one side to another, because robots you can put into a truck and carry from one side to another. So this is another evolvement of our business model that is very exciting for us, because it provides value to our customers, more flexibility, but it also provides value to us. So this is more on how we see our business model and our strategy evolve.
So, hello and thank you for the interesting discussion. My name is Helen Lederer and I study business administration in the Masters. And I have the question, how do you attempt to identify what the customer will need in the future? So do you do it through surveys or, I don't know, market analysis? Because, of course, the world is changing and, as you said, maybe we don't need parcels in the future anymore, we don't know. So that's the question.
I think it's a good idea to have discussions with professional customers. So on the B2B side, I obviously have a lot of exchanges where things go. On the consumer side, I think you need to be very careful. So you can ask consumers, but don't do what they ask for. You need to do the synthesis. I mean, I think no consumer would ever have ordered, or I would have at least not sketched an iPhone as something that I want when there was no iPhone. So, and I think in logistics this is quite similar. You need to understand and interpret what consumers particularly say. And I give you one example in our industry where I think I got it right, but the judgment is still out. We never got into same-day delivery for consumers as DHL. Never. And people bugged me also when I was running the German business and say, you need to get, people want it always quicker and you need to have this 3-hour service. And I said, we can't do it. We can't do it. I can't see how the consumer is willing to pay for what the production of that service really costs us. And a lot of consumers said, I want it. But if you had in detail the discussion, what are you willing to pay for? I always had my doubts. Also what people said they would be willing to pay for. So this is one of those things where you ultimately need to judge, do you go into that or not? Yeah? And you also need to be careful that you judge too much from your own behavior, which we all have a bias to, right? I order a lot of things online, but I order one weekend and I need it on the next weekend. I don't look at the stuff during the week. Generally, might be one exception a year or so. But that is not the average and not a typical consumer behavior. Some of you want it a bit more urgently than from one week to another. So But I was convinced that this extremely quick 3-hour delivery, particularly in Europe, would stay an absolute niche. And that is something that you can't get, a result on from consumer research alone. You ultimately need to understand also in great detail what is the cost structure that you really have to deliver such a service, and then develop a judgment whether people are really willing to pay for that. You have conjoint analysis and similar things that you can do on that, but on these really fundamental shifts of behavior is not very reliable. You can run a conjoint, how much milk you can say at which price point, because people know what milk is, they know whether they like milk or not, and so forth. There it works very well, but on new services is very difficult. I hope my marketing people don't see this video.
Hi, I have a quick question. You said that you got a, let's say, very good role by speaking your mind and having a strong opinion. I think that can also backfire. How can you try to not make it backfire? And also on the other hand, how do you as an organization empower people to speak their mind and get opinions? Thank you.
So I think you will find that people generally appreciate if you care about them and help them. And it goes both ways, is independent of hierarchy. If you as a leader care about your people and they feel you have a true positive interest in their development, they typically like that. But as a leader, you also like it if people try to help you. So generally, I think in a modern organization, it is well recognized also by leaders that if somebody speaks his mind, it is in your true interest. You obviously need to do this in a polite and non-confrontative way, and you need to be culturally sensitive to that. I was recently also with a political delegation in China, and the way you do these things in China is different than how you do this in Europe. And I think there we Europeans also need to be a bit more mindful that our way of telling each other the truth along every dimension is maybe not the way which is seen as polite and conducive in other cultural contexts. And there's a bit here the feeling that this is the way it's done, but many people in Asia feel different around this. And in Latin America, maybe similarly. But if you take those cultural elements into account and you behave politely, I think you will recognize if you speak up, if you have the facts on your side and you don't cook them up, people generally appreciate that because they are very much interested to find a good solution.
Were you part of the delegation with the Chancellor?
Yes.
All right. By the way, are there any countries you've not visited? Do you know how many countries you visited so far?
There are definitely some that I haven't visited. Africa has an astonishing number of countries, and I've definitely not been to all. I think I don't recall. I once did the count, I think last Christmas, but I don't recall the exact number.
Okay.
But it's the planet has an astonishing number of countries, and I think I'm roughly at half now.
Okay, all right. That's pretty decent. So.
Hi, Sina Langenbacher from MU. My question is, from your point of view, which are the most important skills for a manager or CEO to be successful?
So I think one I already shared on the intrinsics in terms of be able to compartmentalize and deal with things that you can't solve and that you just have to somehow live with. Yeah, including certain threats to the organization and your people where you definitely need to take careful decisions, but you can't carry that around for 24 hours during the day. So I think that is an important intrinsic skill that you can maybe somehow develop that also needs to be, is to a great extent, I think, intrinsic. For me, what was elsewise helpful is just to keep a relatively practical sense, and also do a bit of that cross-check that I mentioned earlier. So does that make sense? Do the numbers end up, right? The simple triangulation, A times B is C, right? What people present to you, does that make sense? That sounds maybe very basic, but even in complex processes, people sometimes get it fundamentally wrong. And it is obviously very important for you as decision maker to see that and have a sense on the number side, but also practically. This is why I spend a lot of time still in our operations. And I listen to our country managers very carefully. Wherever I go, I spend time with our country managers and our country management teams, also without the interim levels of hierarchy. And I spend time with our couriers, for instance. It's very interesting with couriers because the first hour people tell you what they pre-cooked, right? What they were told to tell you or what they think they need to tell you. But if you are with a courier, with one of our delivery guys in the vehicle for more than an hour, then you typically get to the truth of things. And this has a certain value. It's obviously an investment of time, but I always find this very valuable to have these direct touch points. And this gives you a good sense of what works and what doesn't work. So this is what I would say in terms of some of the ingredients that I think are important. But it's also important to recognize we are a service business, right? If I would run an automotive company, I think some of those elements would be different. Technical judgment obviously then becomes more important than this, feeling whether your people like the job, whether the processes are good, and so forth.
You do not have an R&D department, right? So DHL does not have
we don't have real R&D. We, most of the processes that we have, we develop on the fly, so to say, in the business. We have what we call an innovation center, which is a bit of a collection of technology that is available, but to really put this in action and make logistical processes out of it that have an end-to-end value proposition to our customer that you can basically only do live.
All right.
Hello, my name is Didar Reshev, and I would like to ask you regarding advantages and disadvantages being on the CEO role. What would you say that was the hardest thing to accept while you was on the role, and was the most enjoyable, I would say?
So I think it depends a little bit what type of business you run. So we are the divisional business, where I have 5 divisional CEOs that run their own business. So I have some functional responsibility as well, for IT, for instance, for procurement, for some of the other things that I talked about. But this is a very different role than if you run a functional business. So when I was running the German business, for instance, the German business is organized functionally, meaning you have a string that is operations, you have sales, you have marketing and pricing, you have finance, and they report to you as a divisional CEO. That role, which I very much enjoyed, is much more operational, because you as a CEO have to do the classical functional trade-off between operations and sales, for instance, right? The sales guys always want low prices, they want new features for the customer tomorrow and so forth. And the operations guys will say, no, we can't change that fast and we need to have a stable setup. The sales guys, by the way, need to deliver a better forecast so that we can plan better the resources, otherwise you can't expect quality and good cost and so forth. And you have a much more operational role to, for instance, on the forecast, need to ultimately make the call, what is the capacity we planned for before Christmas, which for all the German parcel business is always a very interesting question, right? How many additional people do you need for these 4 weeks of peak activity, which on the one hand side, if you hire too many resources, you're obviously inefficient. On the other hand, if you have too little, it becomes a quality bloodbath, right? So that is a very different role than running a divisional organization, and it's also a different role than my DHL colleagues, or DHL Express, for instance, has, which has under the global CEO role, regional CEOs, and then country CEOs. And only under the countries you have operations, sales, and so forth. So the structure truly matters, what your operational and day-to-day tasks are, and how much operationally involved you are.
So hello, my name is Nicole. Thank you for being here. I'm studying business administration in the master, and I want to ask, how do you manage it to not spend too much time with operational tasks, as you mentioned that this is an issue in your position?
Well, I would frame it the other way around. I actually like to spend more time on operational tasks when they're really related to our operations and customers. It's more a challenge, how do you manage more the administrative processes without doing major pitfalls. So we have on Friday, for instance, our annual shareholder meeting where you need to prepare quite diligently because you don't want that from a legal standpoint to go wrong. But how much time do you really spend? How much time do you spend on lawsuits that you might have as an opportunity, to go after others, so to say, because you have certain rights that were violated, or lawsuits that were put upon you? How much time do you spend to make sure it's adequately taken care of, but on the same time doesn't consume too much of your time, because this is obviously not what, in a positive way, will help you to develop the company. So this is more where I see, the balance that you need to find on those more administrative elements. Spending time in operations and with customers, and operations obviously entails spending time with our people. That is more the area where I think you can't do enough. You just need to make sure that you free up enough time to really be able to do that.
Speaking of time, we have time for one more question. So last question, make it a good one.
My pleasure. Hello, this is Ria from Zoom, and listening to your story of how you become who you are today, everything sounds very, I would say, like chill. Because when you were handed with the job of CEO, you're like, yeah, I got it. I wonder what is your life principles or life philosophies you have.
So I'm not sure whether I'm good at philosophy yet. Maybe that comes later in life. But I made some very clear decisions, and I give you just one example. It might sound ridiculous, but I made it a point not to spend time on things that are not important to me. So my clothing, for instance, is entirely standardized. I only have one type of shirts. I always buy the same shirts. And I needed to change shoes now because after 15 years and I think 19 pairs, the producer stopped producing that type of shoe. I have the same suits from the same tailor in Singapore since 1999. I always wear red ties, and I keep wearing the same tie until it's gone, and then I have the next red tie, and I always order them in a pack of 5. Because I don't want to spend time on it. It doesn't make my life better. And I have several of those things that I did where I said, okay, this is what I do and this is what I don't do. And that is something which I think, at least in terms of time management, maybe you don't have to be as radical in some of those choices, but I think it is important to make some of those choices to just have enough time and still have also some form of life. There are also people who, and I find this especially in politics interesting, where I also have some limited insights, but we have politicians that don't really have a life anymore. which I also find an interesting concept, how you deal with that. But that would be not my part. I still want to have some level of private life, also because I have a family.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful visit.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you.